Now, my task here tonight is simple, and that's to welcome you to the House and remind you that this is just, of course, the first of many great events that are coming up. So let me just name a few. Come back next week, same time on Thursday, September 23rd, for the launch of Claire Kilroy's book, Soldier Sailor, which will be launched by our colleague, Connor Creaney. September 23rd, Monday, go over to the bitter end here in the Village on Bleecker for an Irish music concert in honor of Mick Maloney. And September 26th, back here again to launch Robert Polner and Michael Truberty's book on Paulo Dwyer. So just a series of great book launches just to start us off here in September, and that's just the beginning. So please check our website and find out what's available for you for events. Just a reminder, following our event tonight, we will have a reception downstairs, so please stick around. As always, during our Q&A, we'll be circulating with a mic. There's just one mic tonight, so please just be patient, allow us to get to you, and we will have you repeat the question, I think, as necessary to make sure that everybody hears on both sides of our nice split level room. Before we launch into what I think will be an excellent event, not the first time that we've had Jimmy Breslin up for discussion here at Glucksman Island House, but let me remind you to silence your cell phones. And with that, let me turn over to John Waters, my colleague in Ireland House and Department of English.
Thanks very much, Nick. You're all very welcome. It is great to be here. It's great to be back. It's great to start another academic year. And it's great to welcome Dan to the House. Before I introduce Dan and get into the meat of the evening, though, first I want to welcome a few people by name, if that's okay. And the first person I have to say is Loretta's here. Loretta Glucksman's here. So if you want to know all of the, let me let people get on in. Look who it is. Look at who it is. He snuck into the front row. How are you, Colin? Welcome. Welcome. This is going to be a great. So, if you want to get all the details about Dan Barry's career, the Rhode Island, Long Island, Rhode Island, the About New York, About This Land, all the awards, as my father would say, you could look it up. I'm not going to spend too much time and waste of time. But I want to begin also by saying Dan's always been a friend to Ireland House. This is an important thing to say, that a place like this works because of community, right? And we have a community here, and people with great gifts like Colin McCann and like Dan Barry, they give their time and they make their contribution to the community. And it happens to be that through Loretta's largesse, we have a house where that community can come together. And Dan has always been here since I got here in 2000. When I got here in 2000, there was a crowd of journalists around, a crowd of writers. They were having a lot of fun. They'd been having fun for the 5 years before I got here. They kept having fun afterwards. But they would be here for each other's book launches, for each other's parties, and for other special events, some of the academic events as well. Some of them were later in their career, like Pete Hamill and Peter Quinn, but others were mid-career, like certainly Colin and Terry Galway, and then certainly Dan as well. I'm trying to think of, like I said, I don't want to go into too much of the depth about Dan, but I want to tell a little personal story, just in the sense that I grew up in a house that I think similar to the one that Dan did in Brooklyn, and it was a newspaper house.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, maybe it was a little, yeah. Well, we got over it though, right? We got through it. But a newspaper house, right? And that meant there were 5 newspapers delivered to my house every day, right? 3 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. The Times, the News, and the Wall Street Journal were there every morning. And the Post and the Press, the Long Island Press, came in the afternoon. And that was down from what it had been in the early 60s, which is one of the things that comes up in this wonderful, some of Jimmy Breslin's wonderful columns about the death of the Tribune and whatnot. But my parents every morning would sit and have coffee with the newspaper, and they would trade. They would mention the people that they were reading. And one of the things that happened when I moved back to New York in 2000, they were living in the Village here nearby, and I got to go over and have coffee with them in the morning. And one of the things they started to say was, "Did you read about New York? Did you read the About New York?" And they would pass this around. And then I got to a point that I said, I met that guy. I know that guy. I've had words with that fellow, Dan Barry. And that happened here at Ireland House, and it happened in a sort of close contact. And my father, who was a veteran newspaper reader, and he spent 90% of the day with print in front of his face, always singled out, just said, this is part of the tradition. This is what Dan is doing is part of the tradition of a very deeply important writing tradition in America and in Irish America. Reporting, as Dan Barry practices it, is an excuse, as Tim Robinson, the great cartographer and geographer, said. It's an excuse to go anywhere and question anyone about anything, right? Which is a sort of nice way to sort of get through the world. And then it seems to me, I think about Dan as someone who talks to everyone, and he treats everyone the same, right? And he also never stops looking for a place to sort of drop in a crack. That's a careful, but there's what distinguishes the writing. There's a careful respect for words, right? It begins with a respect for words, and it's matched by the essential ingredient for good reporting, which is respect for people. And the result is empathetic and egalitarian. And that's a kind of communication that I think is fundamental to the very possibility of life in a multicultural, multiracial democracy. We can't underestimate the importance of our writers and artists and newspapermen in actually creating the possibilities for living together, right? And so Dan is a writer who gives voice to others, but that's part of what I think made Jimmy Breslin so important, so loved, and it's also what brings us here today. We're here to talk about the writing of somebody who gave real, genuine respect to the people that he wrote about. So I want to congratulate first Dan on bringing together this beautiful book for the Library of America. And I think, if it's okay with you, I'd like to begin maybe by talking, a little bit about this question about why Jimmy Breslin makes it into the Library of America. That's a big deal. Jimmy Breslin and Thomas Jefferson. Didn't think of them together, but there it is. It's a real thing. So what do you think, Dan? Is that a place to begin?
Auspicious beginning. Yeah, so if you think about the Library of America, there aren't really any newspaper journalists. There's Ring Lardner, who, is remembered more as a short story writer now, and A.J. Liebling, more of a critic. But Breslin was like, boots on the street kind of journalist, right? And so it's kind of interesting that they agreed that he was worthy. And of course, I thought he was worthy from the beginning. And John's talking about how he grew up. I've told this story before. My father was a huge newspaper reader, and every morning I'd come down and have my cornflakes, and he would never say, "I love you." He would never say good morning. What he would say is, "Read Breslin today." That's what he would say. That was, and weirdly, that's an expression of love if you think about it, I think, right? And I was telling John earlier that when I think about Breslin's work, I think that what he conveyed was this kind of empathetic rage. And I think some of us can identify with that. It was hearing people, meeting them where they are, and then understanding their plight and their challenges, and then transforming that into a raging fist against the authorities that are mostly responsible for that plight, right? So why is he worthy? I just want to give you 1 week in Jimmy Breslin's life, okay? So John F. Kennedy is shot. Breslin has just started a column for the New York Herald Tribune. He had been a sports writer, really wonderful sports writer. And he would also often talk about how important sports writing was to his view of the world, right? Because you're on deadline and you're trying to find the epic in the everyday. And that's what he certainly did. So Kennedy gets shot. Breslin gets his large self down there. And it's in the record. The first thing that he does is he finds the emergency room doctor who is eating salmon croquets in the hospital cafeteria when he gets a call, stat, and it is emergency. He runs up there, and there on a gurney is the President of the United States, okay? And the doctor's name is Malcolm Perry. Breslin must have debriefed Perry, okay? And he puts you in the damned operating room. He puts you there when in the corner, Jacqueline Kennedy is watching everything. Another doctor comes in and says, you know, we can make you more comfortable elsewhere. Would you like to be in another room? And all she says is no, okay? And a dress is splattered with blood, right? And Breslin makes you feel every moment, every effort to try and save the president's life, even though everybody in the room pretty much knows it's hopeless. Then at some point, a priest comes in, okay? This is just one line in like maybe a 2,000 or 3,000 word piece that Breslin wrote on deadline when the entire country, the entire world is in some kind of like PTSD state. So the priest comes in, he says, everything that was inside that room now belonged to Jacqueline Kennedy and Father Oscar Huber and the things in which they believe. That's it. That's it. And you go, holy smoke. So he writes that. And then if there are any journalists in the room first, I'm sorry for that. But that means that you know the story of the gravedigger. It's probably the most famous column in American journalistic history, okay? And what happened was Breslin was trying to figure out what's the next story he does, okay? And there's going to be a lot of pageantry at Arlington. There's going to be, you know, in the White House, there's, you know, Haile Selassie, everyone's, you know, there, heads of state from around the world. But also, every journalist in the world is there, or so it seems. And Breslin is having a drink with Art Buchwald, and he says, I'm thinking of going to the cemetery and talking to the gravedigger. And Buchwald says, that's a pretty good idea. And that's all that Breslin needed to grant himself license to not go with the crowd, okay? That's an important instinct. If the crowd's going that way, you go this way. And Breslin was the king of that. And so, of course, he goes to the cemetery. He finds the guy who's digging President Kennedy's grave. His name is Clifton Pollard. He was a World War II veteran. He had been in Burma, and he was making $3.01 an hour. These are the details that Breslin was a master of. $3.01 an hour. And you know a lot about Clifton Pollard just from that, don't you, right? Okay, so he does the famous gravedigger column, and it's an honor. That's what Clifton Pollard kept saying. It's an honor. Okay, fine. If I had written the gravedigger column, I would have retired. There's no more I can do, all right? Right. So he's already done the Malcolm Perry piece, and now he's done the gravedigger all in a few days. It's time to go home and have a few pops. No. He comes back to New York, certainly. And what he does is, it's if you remember, it was November 1963. Well, then comes Thanksgiving, okay? So instead of staying at home with his family or mailing it in or saying I need a day off, he goes to an automat on 8th Avenue and 33rd Street, a spot I pass every day when I go to work. And he sits there and listens to these men, lonely men who have nowhere else to go on Thanksgiving. You know, they're living in SROs, they're salesmen, retired salesmen, and he listens to them. And they're sitting there, you know, stubbing their cigarettes out in the ashtrays and drinking coffee and just talking and crumpling up napkins, okay? And Breslin's there on Thanksgiving morning after having done really extraordinary journalistic work, right? And this is how it ends, this column. A lot of other people sat alone. Only 1 or 2 tables were empty. They came in and took trays and waited silently on line at the cafeteria steam tables for their food. There are very few coin slots left in the automat these days. There were 2 banks of coin slots with their little windows for sandwiches, one for pies, another for cakes, and one for bread and rolls. There was only 1 bank for the baked macaroni and cheese, 3 nickels, and beef pie, 1/4, 3 nickels, and other automat specialties. Coffee still comes out of a spout with a silver handle. It costs 10 cents and still is good coffee. Outside, 8th Avenue was vacant. A few cabs moved by, now and then a bus. The few people on the street were old and alone. There were some post office workers. They were paid yesterday, and they scouted around 8th Avenue for someplace open so they could cash the check. Otherwise, it was a vacant day in the automat. Which was right? Yesterday was a day meant to be vacant. It seemed right to sit on Thanksgiving Day and put out butts in a coffee cup, and every once in a while have an attendant in white shirt and slacks reach past your shoulder and take crumpled napkins from the table. So if you think about that, what he's saying, what he's doing is, without ever mentioning the name of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, he's capturing a nation in mourning. I think that's extraordinary. So that's why he's worth this volume.
Well done, yes. I'm so glad you began with that, Dan. Also, we talked a little bit about scene setting, right? That one of the things that made Breslin's column so exceptional is his openings are just brilliant. They're incredibly visual, right? And they're also temporally involving, right? They get you involved in a visual scene, and then in a temporal scene that sort of absorbs you completely, and it's that read as if it was masterful fiction, right? That was as if it was beautifully crafted, imaginative literature, and yet it was his column written about exactly what happened. I just don't know that's an alchemy, right? There's an alchemy for that kind of wedding. I'm thinking
On
about a little bit
deadline.
about style.
On deadline.
Yeah, on deadline, yeah. But about the question of style and Jimmy Breslin's work, there's an immense amount to be covered under that question, right? About the observational detail, but also about sentence making, and less is more, right? I mean, his style is really pared back, right? There's no excess. There's observation, and it's the cleverness of choice. Would you say that's a consistent feature through the body of the work that you read?
Absolutely. He was a master of the spare. Okay. He's also a master of the unsaid. He trusts his reader, right? He trusts that they'll get it. Okay. And so he had a persona, as we all know, of being, the guy at the bar, on Queens Boulevard, good drinking beer, that kind of stuff. And he worked hard to create that persona. And I think it was actually, I am in fact a psychiatrist. No, I do think that it was a protective shell that he created, okay, to keep something private to himself. So he had this persona of the good drinking beer kind of guy who's hail fellow well met at the bar. But in fact, he went to college for like a half an hour, okay? He went right into newspapers. But having said that, he was an avid reader and a careful reader. And so he, for all his that persona, he was well-versed in Dostoevsky, in Dickens, in Hemingway. He paid attention to the language. And so he's paying attention to the language on deadline. He knows that when you're reading a newspaper, and I think about this all the time, you are looking for reasons not to read a story because there's so many other stories, okay? You're wanting to bail. So it's a game, isn't it? It's a game to try and keep your attention for like 2 or 3 seconds or maybe 6 seconds with your opening paragraph, okay? And hope that the reader will say, okay, that's worth another 6 seconds, right? And then if he delivers with that, with humor, poignancy, rage, empathetic rage, whatever it is, then maybe you're in, okay? So he was the master of that. And these columns are like short stories oftentimes because he promises something with that beginning. He draws you in, and invariably the ending delivers. it's worth the effort. It's worth the 3 minutes that he's taken from you.
How much variation did he have? I mean, so when you read when you look at the volume, you read the back, there's the acknowledgments for where things came from. And the range of places where he was published, and particularly early in his career, is all over the place. Sports Illustrated, Sport, but Washington Post, all the major newspapers, periodicals. He's writing for a lot of different places. What did you learn about the variety of lengths at which he composed, right? I mean, and did you have a sense for how that worked for him about, was he given lots more space than other journalists, or did he?
I think when he was doing the column, it's an expectation that it'll be, 700-800 words or so. But I think that he was such a special talent that if he said, look, this story about Malcolm Perry, which he's running a deadline, is worth 2,000 or 3,000 words, Jim Bellows and whoever else was in charge at the Herald Tribune said, have at it, okay? You don't, at least in this volume, you don't read anything and say, oh, that should have been longer, or that should have been shorter, okay? He seems oftentimes to hit it just right, that he understands what each word is worth.
Exactly what I was trying to get at, is that sense of there's an accordion shape to the scale. Some things are 2 pages and they're perfectly punchy. Some are 10 or 12 and they're really absorbing and engaging. The other thing about this volume, so if you don't have it, you'll leave with it, right? Because it's available here. But I think it would be immensely useful if you're teaching journalism or thinking about teaching writing, but also for the second half of the 20th century in North America. This is an incredibly interesting work of history, right? A witness to history. And I'm sure you were thinking about that as you were editing. That it's not shaped by that, but it really is. I mean, so many of the central tensions and issues of the last 50 years are brilliantly explored in Breslin's work.
Yeah, when I was doing the volume, I have to say that I was surprised at how many places he had been and how often he was a witness to history. So it's one thing to be a witness to history over and over and over again. It's quite another to be a witness to history and then turn that into journalistic art, which he did over and over again. And so he's there when Malcolm X is assassinated, okay? He's there dealing with the emergency room doctor after Kennedy's assassination. He goes to Selma. And so everyone is following the march in Selma. And what does Breslin do? He veers away from the march and he travels a few miles and he finds a schoolhouse, and it's a dump, okay? Which means it was a schoolhouse for Black kids. And he spends time there. He talks to the kids, he talks to the teachers, and then he looks at the books that are there, okay? And actually, the principal says, you're not supposed to go into the building. We've been told that you shouldn't go into the building. And Breslin says, why? And the guy says, whatever. And he says, clearly, the state of Alabama doesn't want anyone to go into this building to report what's in there. And he says to the principal, if you don't mind, I'm going to defy that order and go into your building. And the principal basically steps aside because the principal gets it. And he goes in and he looks at the books, and they're old, moldy books from 1939. So from when Breslin was a kid, okay? And teaching of math had changed dramatically in a generation or 2 generations. So Breslin finds those details, right? So he's the witness to history, but he makes it real for you. So then he's there for when Bobby Kennedy gets shot. He's there for the Crown Heights riots. He goes to Northern Ireland. He goes to Vietnam. It's one thing after another after another. He seems always to be there.
Reminds me of the Medal of Honor winner story about the Orange Bowl and the guy from Queens who would he dine out on it or not, or how would he sort of use it? And he gets the other thing that Jimmy Breslin did brilliantly. I think your selection brings out is the voices. He gets dialogue right. Again, it's like he's a fiction writer who takes real care with the dialogue, but it's just that he had an ear for picking out the right phrases that someone said and honoring their voice, right? I think you do that too, though. I think you do that too. I think when people speak in your columns, you hear them speaking. You can believe that's a very honest selection of what someone said. I think that's the hallmark of Breslin's quoting.
And the piece that you're referring to, it concerns a young man named O'Malley, and he's from Queens, and he's won the Congressional Medal of Honor. And Breslin is seeing the man's future, okay? Because at this moment, he's the toast of the town. He has dates waiting for him at various bars around the city. He has no idea who the guy next to him is. The guy next to him at some dinner is Omar Bradley, okay, a very famous World War II general. He's just a kid who did something heroic. And you could see Breslin like hoping that the kid will get it, that this will lead to maturity and to something positive rather than just drinking on the dime of the medal. You know what I mean? Very, very prescient and smart and empathetic.
As much as we think about him as a writer of empathy and of extension to the common man, he loved hating his enemies, right? I mean, there's some people who get it. They get it in the neck. Or they get it indirectly. I mean, he wasn't it seems to me he doesn't write like a bully ever, but like,
Oh yeah, he did.
yeah. Well, to Spiro Agnew, I mean, if you're going to be a bully to someone, be a bully to Spiro Agnew. That Spiro Agnew column is.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind reading from that, but yeah. So Breslin for years did a thing around New Year's Day, if you remember this. People I'm not talking to this year, which is just brilliant. And it could be anyone from the President of the United States to some guy at the end of the bar who pissed him off because he gave him a dirty look. You know, it could be anything like that. And of course, he famously was good friends with Hugh Carey, the governor of New York. And in later years, Hugh Carey, you know, according to Breslin, kind of went off the rails. And he gave him a new nickname, and it stuck. He was very good at nicknames, better than Trump, actually. And he called him Society Carey, and it stuck. What John's referring to is after the tragedy at Attica, Spiro Agnew basically was saying that all those men involved should be executed. Does that sound familiar? Uh-oh. So Breslin, by the way, Breslin was a devout Catholic. He took his faith very, very seriously. And one of my favorite books, actually, is The Church That Forgot Christ. So what it is Breslin, who did everything right by the Catholic Church and believed in it, and then felt so profoundly betrayed that at the end of that book, he's proposing to create his own church, and that he would be the Pope of his own church. So he takes Agnew's thought. What Agnew said was to compare the loss of life by those who violate society's law with the loss of life of those whose job it is to uphold it represents not simply an assault on human sensibility, but an insult to reason. Okay, so he's quoting Agnew, and so Breslin then uses one word. Can anyone guess what the word is? Beautiful. Beautiful. He always said beautiful. Okay, and so he does this riff. Beautiful. I think it was the greatest article I read in my whole life. Governor Rockefeller seems to feel the way Agnew does, but Rockefeller has a family background for things like this, the Ludlow Massacre and all that. Agnew's terrific article came from the heart. Because of it, I finally was able to brush off the last shreds of the stupid ideas Sister Anna Gertrude outfitted us with in St. Benedict Joseph Library School, Queens, New York City. That silly Jesus Christ. The way that old nun made us learn it, Jesus spent the whole last morning of his life standing in part 32 with a real bum named Barabbas. And he goes on, how do you like it? How do you like what some backward nun put into my head? Here's a guy has nails in him, and he is wasting his time giving amnesty to a thief, And they had me believing for a long time, Sister Anna Gertrude and the other nuns in St. Benedict Joseph Library School, Queens, New York City, that this Jesus Christ was great because he died thinking of thieves. I should have spent my time looking at dirty pictures. He just drills Agnew, it's unbelievable. Also, every time he refers to Jesus, he capitalizes the H in him and he. So Breslin is signaling the opposite.
We don't need to read the Trump one. That's one to put in for your later reading because it's brilliant. It's brilliant. He understood him extremely well. And the way
Right. And John, just quickly, he took umbrage with the fact that Trump was called the Donald. He said, like the Bronx.
Wow. Can we talk for a second about the fiction? Because he also wrote novels, right? And high school kid, I read The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight and I thought it was fantastic. I remember just laughing out loud and it got in my head in a big way. I started to talk like these characters. I got interested in the Mafia as a sort of, but it was all comic and there's some great, columns here about the Mafia. Those are, some of you I know were here for the big event that we did for Jimmy Breslin around 2010. We had a big celebration of his work. We had a whole raft of writers and Dan was there. Dan was one part of it. But Carl Hyacin told one of the funniest stories I've ever heard in my life about when Jimmy Breslin came down to Florida to meet some retired mobsters. Hyacin is just an incredibly funny person himself. But that's a whole other world of Jimmy Breslin's work is not of humanizing mobsters, but of humanizing mobsters and understanding them as people. They're people who make a living. They got to make a living. They might make a living in a way that's morally objectionable, but there's lots of morally objectionable people around. So you talk to the mobsters, and I think his fiction, at least that's where I first encountered it. And I wonder how that worked for you within the context of the book and thinking about the body of work in the fiction.
Well, I read Table Money, which holds up, and World Without End, Amen, right? And so what's extraordinary to me is that he's writing this column 3 times a week, maybe more, and then he's finding time to write fiction. I honestly don't know how he did it. If you talk to Breslin's children, what they remember is that he was basically always typing, and to leave him alone and they could hear the clack, clack, clack of the typewriter. It was like the soundtrack of their lives, the guy clack, 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 right? So that's how he did it. And what he turned out was quite extraordinary.
How much of that there wasn't a brief to bring it into the volume much, the fiction?
No, it was considered just a nonfiction thing, and there are 2 nonfiction books in the volume. One is How the Good Guys Finally Won, which is a very good account of the fallout from Watergate and kind of celebrates heroes that are named, Woodward and Bernstein's, like Peter Rodino, guys who are doing the nuts and bolts of putting the cases together, and Tip O'Neill. And then the other book is The Short Sweet Dream of Eduardo Gutierrez. And I strongly recommend that you read that because it really gets to Breslin's empathetic rage, I think. And that is centered on an actual incident in Brooklyn where a Mexican laborer was killed when shoddy work arrangement led to a collapse of a building and he died in it. And Breslin, who, by the way, never learned to drive, wound up going to Mexico and finding out who this young man was, right? Because normally there'd be like a 4-paragraph piece in the Post or the News or the Times. And Breslin slows it down and says, well, who was this young man? Where did he come from? What were his dreams? And it required him to go to Mexico, and he did. It's a beautifully written piece, and it also will fill you with rage about the immigration laws and about the Giuliani administration and about how things work.
But it's a really late work for Jimmy, wasn't it? It was really late in his career that he wrote that book. And it was fairly fresh even in 2010 when he was here at Ireland House. I mean, a few other sort of things or questions. I don't know if we're around the time. We're around the time when we should probably open it up to questions from the floor. Is that okay? No.
You don't want me to tell my Breslin story?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Wait a second. Well, we each have a Breslin story that we said we would tell. And you go first.
No, you go first.
All right, I'll go first. So when Jimmy was here for the big event, I had met him once before. I met him in 1989 because I was dating a girl who I'd met when she was at Duke, and she'd come up to New York. She was working here in the city, and she was running Ronnie Eldridge's campaign for the city council in 1989. And she was her, sort of chief of staff then. And so there was one occasion where I was with this woman, Margaret, in the backseat of a cab and backseat of a car, and they were up front, and we drove around, and Jimmy Breslin was hilarious. I didn't get to say a word to him. I was starstruck. I was, fair enough. That goes by. And then 21 years later, we're at Ireland House. The big event is over. It's a spectacular night. And I went up to Jimmy and introduced myself again with Ronnie, and Ronnie remembered the occasion, remembered Margaret, my friend. I said, can I help you get to your car? And Jimmy was a little frail, and he literally took my arm, he hooked my arm, and we started talking, and I said, I got to tell you one thing, you almost got me killed when I was in high school. He said, how did I do that? As if there was something that he had done that he felt bad about. And so when I was 16, I was running. I was a track runner, and I'd run in Marine Park, Brooklyn, and it'd be a mile from my house out, a couple of laps around the track, back around the oval, and then back home. And one time I was coming back, and a guy in a Monte, right, guy in a Monte Carlo, runs a stop sign and puts me on the hood of the car, like literally. And I was nimble enough that I just jumped up and I bounced off, and I slammed my hand on the hood of his car. And kept going, and he chased me. And so he chased me down Avenue P. I ran around the Carvel parking lot and crossed Ocean Avenue and ran over to 29th Street and went down this way because it was the opposite day. And I get to the next corner, and he's waiting for me. And he pulls up next to me, and he stops. Finally, he's near enough to me, and he's a zipper-headed muscle guy. And I had just read The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. And the girl, Maria, in The Gang That Couldn't Shoot, she got a mouth on her, right? And so this guy stops, and he looks out the window at me, and he points at me. And I just had this line from Jimmy Breslin's book, and they said, get cancer. And he went crazy. He went completely crazy. He drove the wrong way down East 28th Street between N and M to try to sort of get back to me. And I had to go through back to Kelly's backyard and run up the next block. And I managed to sort of get away from it. When I told Jimmy Breslin this story about how, that line getting in his head almost got me killed, he loved it. He was like, that's a genuine sort of Brooklyn story. And then, I'd hoped to see him another time after that. It never happened. That was the last time I had an occasion to be with him. So.
Get cancer?
I should say this to a guy who wrote a really good book about growing up on Long Island and battling cancer. Yeah, it's a terrible thing.
So you teed me up because that relates to my Breslin story, and I apologize to people who've heard it before. I was writing the About New York column, and then I got cancer, and I don't know how. And I had never met Breslin before, but I get a call one day saying, "When are you going to that place?" And it was Breslin. I said, "What?" And he said, "When are you going to that place for that thing?" And it dawned on me, he was talking about Memorial Sloan Kettering. And I said, "Well, I have to go there on Thursday for a procedure." He goes, "I'll go with you." I said, "What the hell?" I said, "I don't even know this guy." And he's calling me up saying he's going to go with me to Sloan Kettering. He goes, "I'll go with you. Meet me at 72nd and Broadway." And so on Thursday, I have to go to Sloan Kettering to go through this procedure. And I know what he looks like, but he doesn't know what I look like. And so I see him walking down the street, looking around. And I went up to him and I said, Mr. Breslin, I'm Dan Barry. He said, Jimmy, let's go. So now he's in charge. It's my cancer day. He's in charge. So we start walking east, right? And he just starts telling stories. He starts telling stories about John Gotti. He starts telling stories about the Gallo brothers, Emil Griffith, Benny Perret, all these great stories. And, suddenly we're on the other side of the park. And then he keeps talking and he's telling these stories. I'm just laughing and I'm just in awe. And then suddenly we're in front of Sloan Kettering. And I said, well, geez, thank you, Mr. President. Thanks very much. He goes, I'll go in with you. I said, what the hell are you talking about? When's your wife getting over here? And I said, she'll be here and he'd been cursing up a storm the whole time, like just dropping F-bombs. When is she gonna get here and all this kind of stuff? And then Mary shows up. He doesn't curse again, ever, okay? So he comes in with Mary and me into Sloan Kettering, and I go and I check in, and they say, we have to go in this room to get into one of those little pajama things. I don't look good in them. I don't know about you guys, but, and the little paper slippers and everything. And I come out and Breslin's still there. So I'm in front of my hero and I'm like in this like gown and paper slippers. And then they put me in this little room, very small. And it is Mary, me in my gown and slippers, and Jimmy Breslin. It's like, this is crazy. I mean, it was like, like 4x4. We're just there like this. And he's just telling stories. He's just, making Mary laugh and everything like that. And so then it's time for me to go into this procedure. And they come up with a gurney. And he's still standing over me. I'm in the gurney. I'm looking up. And it's Jimmy Breslin. And the joke is I made room for him on the gurney. But he finally left, all right? And I go into the thing, and the procedure is it's not a great result. And so the next day is Friday, and my column would appear on Saturday. And so I'm walking around the streets of the city feeling pretty sorry for myself. And I get a call from Jimmy Breslin. He goes, what do you got for tomorrow? I'm like, oh, well, Jimmy, I was thinking of taking the day off, seeing that, I might be dying. And he goes, fuck that. Look around on the pavement. There's stories everywhere. Right. Goodbye. Like that. Right. And so he's right. So I went back to the newsroom and wrote a column about walking across Central Park without ever naming them and saying that we're all in our own little movies. We're all in our little silos. And if you look around, we're all just trying to get through it. And that's my Jimmy Breslin story. Beautiful. Let's take some questions.
I'm not familiar with the book yet, but I'm wondering if you would all cover his influences. I'm thinking he's very much like a product of his times. I mean, I feel post-noir, there's that urban influence, the storytelling aspect of it. It just feels like, and very highly accessible to, the working man, and I think that's what made it so approachable to people. It's that they could understand it. There was not a lot of highfalutin language, and I'm just wondering if what you thought his influences were. His influences. I mean, I feel like noir, and I'm thinking like Arthur Fleig and all that, crime photography and everything. It was a definite kind of milieu. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think he captured his times, but I also think he was timeless. I think that his view of the world, which is to find the human story in something and then use it to draw back and look at the universal questions. I think that is still relevant today. And if he were around today, I could only imagine how he would address the politics of today, right? I think there would be how he would be in Springfield, Ohio, right now, with the Haitian immigrants and asking what they're having for dinner. Like he would figure out how to make it meaningful. Um, though maybe we're in kind of a, you could argue, a post-noirish environment now. He would figure it out, I think, so.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you for this. It's been really, for me, a fantastic introduction to Jimmy Breslin, and some pieces really stuck with me, particularly the Easter Rising piece about his visit to Dublin on the 50th anniversary. I had two questions. One, a minor one: how the hell did he get around without a car, and why did he never learn how to drive? And then more seriously, just curious about your process in selecting these 73 pieces. How
Sure.
did you go about that?
Sure.
It must have involved a huge process. Thank you.
Okay, so to your first question, is Chris Breslin here? No? Oh, I'm sorry, Chris. So you could answer that. How did he get around to do all that reporting? But before you. Right. So that's exactly right. That's an interesting, by the way, we should have referred to that. John Lennon, Jimmy is at home in Forest Hills, and he gets a call at 11:20 that John Lennon's been shot, and your mom, right, drove him in. Right, right. She did everything. Right. So exactly right. So that's 11:20. They get from Forest Hills to the west side of Manhattan. He hits the police precinct twice, the hospital, the Dakota, and then he's at the newsroom in the Daily News on 42nd Street, and he files by 1:30. Okay. And if you read it, and you were talking about leads and what does he do? How do you write about the assassination of John Lennon? Who's the cop who gets the call, right? And he puts you in the cop car. It's extraordinary. But anyway, the way he got around was his wife Rosemary. Okay, she drove him everywhere all the time. And then in later years, it would be one of his sons, right? Oftentimes, but no, he never learned to drive, which is extraordinary, right? And the question is influence. Oh, uh, I read, a lot of his stuff. Okay, and so he was writing all the time. I think with the Herald Tribune, he was writing 4 times a week, right? And so they're hard to find. But a guy named Dan Klores wanted to do a documentary about him, and he had collected all of the columns, which had been oftentimes reprinted in the Washington Post. They were syndicated. And so I read all of them, and then read all his daily news stuff, and read a lot of his freelance stuff. And I wanted to pick out columns that were both historic and also representative of what I consider to be his journalistic art. I mean, Frank Kleins once told me, he wrote the About New York column. He's a brilliant New York Times writer. He said, when you're writing a column, if you're hitting 400, you're doing pretty well, okay, which means 2 out of 5 are good. Breslin was probably hitting 750, I'd say. There are some that, were bunts down the line, but most of them hold up. And then, I was going to include people I'm not talking to this year. They're funny, but, are they worth posterity? No, it's the other stuff. By the way, his humanization of the AIDS epidemic in the mid-'80s, which helped to have him win a Pulitzer. It's amazing stuff, amazing stuff.
We were talking earlier about his capacity to humanize unsavory characters. When we brought up the gang that couldn't shoot straight, and I wondered, Dan, I often kind of go through the collection of characters that recurred in his column, the real life figures that he would spend time with, and it always struck me as hilarious that, you know, there's this mobbed up pyromaniac for hire, Marvin the Torch, who recurs as like the voice of reason at Jimmy's kitchen table every afternoon. This like sociopath firebug. So I just wondered, who of those characters would have been your favorite? One of those guys that keeps popping up.
Pinocchio, the one-eyed Mafia Don. I liked him. As Danny's pointing out, you know, Jimmy had this kind of cast of characters that would pop up. Marvin the Torch, Klein, the lawyer, Fat Thomas. And Abe Rosenthal, who was the managing editor of the Times at the time, or maybe the Metro editor at the time, thought that Jimmy was full of shit. And so one day he went to Pet McGuire's with Breslin, and he came away, Breslin got him drunk, right? But Rosenthal came out of this saying, it's all true, it's all true. So.
And did you speak to anyone who edited Breslin, if that in fact happened, and what their experience was like?
I would say he probably wasn't an easy edit. Okay. I know this is what he would do. Okay. He would get up maybe at 6 in the morning, right? And then he would just start calling people. Okay. He'd call judges, he'd call Mario Cuomo, and he would call reporters like the City Hall bureau chief for Newsday or the Daily News or in the cop shop and ask what's going on, right? He would call, a friend of mine edited him, and he would call her up the morning he would have a good column, and she would pick up and he'd say, I'm big. And then he'd hang up. I think that Jimmy cared and knew what he wanted to say. So first of all, he had editorial license because he was writing a column, okay? So you're given some leeway there. And you're Jimmy Breslin in the 60s, 70s, 80s. You can do almost anything you want in terms of that. You know, rare was the editor who would challenge him, I think. But I think that he also appreciated good editors who would help him make things better. So in one of the columns, one of the volumes rather, he gives credit to, say, Jim Bellows for coming up to him and saying, well, maybe you don't want to go there or something like that. And Breslin would listen to him, you know, but he could be difficult, I think, on deadline. Yeah. It's an interesting thing about him. I was talking about this with someone else. He had a huge heart. He could be a real unpleasant guy. And there are many people in journalism who don't think fondly of him. They lean towards Pete Hamill. It would sometimes be, oh, you're either a Breslin guy or a Hamill person, right? And Hamill, we all know, was just an absolute sweetheart and a gifted journalist. Breslin, though, I think kind of set a mold in journalistic literature, okay? He was separate and apart from everyone else. And 2, if not 3 generations tried to write like Breslin. And all of them pale in comparison, in my estimation. There's some journalists in the room I see, and they're welcome to disagree with me. Yeah, he could, am I right? He could be unpleasant? Yeah.
One of the things that struck me when you read the pieces, the Breslin pieces, was how you have the feeling that Breslin is talking to one person, and that's the reader. And not only is he just talking to that one person, but he puts that person where he's talking about. It's like, I'm sure with the books that were on the shelves that were falling apart, that the reader feels them in the hand. I think he had the brilliant way of like breaking down the walls, and the reader was in that space. Very intimate, but very conversational at the same time.
That's a good observation. Particularly in his earlier columns, he would use the second person, and writers are often told, don't use the second person. You know, that's you know, the third rail of writing. But he could pull it off, and when he would say you, he meant we, and it was very, very effective to do that. And also what he would do is he was a master of detail, right? And so that's the best of journalism and the best of writing. You know, we're not stenographers, so if I'm in this room, I could, you know, write every detail about this room, but there's only one or two details necessary to put the reader in the room. And he was very, very gifted at picking out those details, you know? So it's a smart thing. Uh-oh.
Dan, I'm looking forward to reading the collection. I haven't read it yet, but one of the things that really struck me about Breslin, and I think set him apart from many other, not all, but many other columnists I read in New York, or actually anywhere in the country, was his that he saw as part of his role that he could to be a reporter and to break big stories. He broke news. If you think the story I still remember, the stories I still remember, I was a young reporter at the Bergen Record, and he wrote about the city for sale, Queens Boulevard scandals, and brilliantly and memorably, even violating the off the record oath with Michael Dowd. So that was also very striking, and I think the folks at the Columbia Journalism Review are still talking about that. But it was brilliant journalism. And on the other hand, on the other far range of that, he could, like Joseph Mitchell of the New Yorker, I guess, among others, he wrote creatively. In other words, he made stuff up, which not to take anything away from his genius on so many levels, but I'm not sure you could get away with that in today's context of journalism so much. But I mean, one story that came to mind with this Haitian pet eating thing was how he had written one column for Newsday about his neighbors. He was annoyed with his neighbors on Central Park West for letting their dogs basically pee when they took him for a walk. So he wrote a rage column about that. It was very amusing.
I didn't include that on the collection.
Should have. But there was the complaints just poured in, as you imagine, from dog lovers. So the way he responded to them was he went up to a sort of storefront, I think Vietnamese restaurant somewhere in the Bronx. Supposedly, it wasn't named, and said that they served dog as part of their menu, and just to get back at his neighbors. And it was amusing, and you understood it was done with a wink, but it was completely, I mean, presumably it was completely made up. So I don't know if I mean, the range there is really striking to me, but that was part of his work, that he would write stories that were, I guess, with a wink and fictionalized, at least in part, if not in whole, in the whole.
Right. And so I don't know how many columns he did over the 50, 60 years that he was a journalist, all right? And so if you're writing 3 or 4 times a week, it could be pretty exhausting, right? I think that when he would write the fictional pieces, I don't think I included any of those. I think the careful readers would know that he was having a go. Do you know what I mean? And then sometimes when people would take him literally, that's when he would get jammed up. but you're also, and your first point about his desire to break news, it really, that's another dimension. You know, he's not sitting back and writing these beautiful essays, albeit on deadline. He's also trying to break news and stun guns, right? Also, as you said, Son of Sam, you know, Bernie Getz. He goes after Bernie. He goes after the city over how they celebrated Bernie Getz. But you're exactly right. What's interesting to me is when he was able to combine all of those. He's breaking news on deadline, right? And also doing it with a literary flair. That is like really friggin' hard. So. No pictures.
I think if another point to sort of follow up with it, we didn't mention it. He's writing all this when there's the so-called new journalism happening, right? When these longer form pieces by people like Tom Wolfe are coming out and are catching. And there's something about the integrity of the way that Breslin stayed rooted in the city and in urban life and as a reporter, right? Rather than a new journalist in a sense. So I read all that stuff voraciously in the 70s when I was a kid. I don't think it holds up. It would hold up in the way that it's as rereadable in a sense as the way these are.
So Tom Wolfe included him among the new journalists, okay, Wolfe and Talese and so on like that. And Breslin was classic Breslin, if you ask me. He's both flattered and insulted at the same time, right? He says, this new journalism is all bullshit. It's, you know, what we're doing is we're sports writers. And, you know, just go look at Jimmy Cannon, look at Westbrook Pegler, you know, and he would cite people, look at Dickens, right? That's what he would say. But if Wolfe had not included Jimmy Breslin, there would have been hell to pay, right?
This is a conversation I'm pretty sure could go on for long, but it's gone on just long enough. So please do two things with me, if you may, three, right? The first is promise you'll join us downstairs for a little drink and a little time together. Second, you'll buy the book. And third, you'll join me in thanking Dan Barry.